Pretty much exactly 2 years ago, I experienced an unexpected upheaval in my life, and I found myself shutting down the organization that I had been running for the last 12 years. And that was a pretty traumatic event for me. And the period of time where we were shutting things down, I fell into a really deep depression. So in about 2 months, I lost 30 pounds. I really couldn't eat at all. It was like I couldn't even take food into my body at that point. My hormones became really dysregulated, and so I found myself going through hot flashes, even though I wasn't at that age, and my sleep became really dysregulated. And so I would lie in bed at night and not be able to sleep and it felt like my body was on fire. And so with all of this, I just started to feel more and more depressed, and I became really suicidal in that period of time. And so there was a group of people in my life who rallied around me and kind of kept things going for me a little bit. They took care of my kids, they took care of me, and I tried to put one foot in front of the other with the things that were required of me in this process that we were going through shutting down the organization at that time. But I just got worse and worse and worse. And so I was taken by a friend to see my doctor and put on antidepressants, and then taken back a while later after it was clear that it wasn't sufficient, and put on a higher dose of antidepressants. I was also given sleeping pills to try and help me to sleep, which was really awful because I didn't really sleep very effectively even with those pills, but it also felt horrendous. The physiological effects of those pills on my body were pretty tough. And I was taking a lot of Ativan for anxiety because I was feeling so much anxiety about what was happening and what I thought might happen in the future in terms of my life and my career, and the sense of failure that I felt, and the sense of uncertainty that I was experiencing my whole life. And that was the first time that I had ever taken any kind of medication. So now I'm taking antidepressants, sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, and just feeling worse and worse and worse. And a friend of mine who I had worked with, and we had been walking a path together for a long time, was handling this process so much better than I was. And one day she said to me, "You know, Amy, the difference between you and me right now is that I'm doing this Dr. Joe stuff and you're not." And she had talked to me about it a while before, and I couldn't. It was like I was imploding. And that really stung when she said that to me, because even though there was a part of me that knew she was right, I just couldn't do it. And so before things got better, they got worse, and I was really unable to function for a period of time from that depression and from being really profoundly suicidal. And then I was able to kind of sit in the pit of that for a really long time, especially after my work had ended, and that was all I had time to really do at that point. And nothing could help me get out of that. Not my two beautiful children, not anybody's words of encouragement. But then one day, I heard that Dr. Joe was coming to do a workshop in Toronto. And there was just something about it that got my attention. And so I reached out to my friend and I said, "Look, I hear he's coming. It's in our city. Do you want to go?" And she said yes. So we made a plan that we were going to go and do this workshop together. And when I made that decision to go and do the workshop, I thought, okay, look, I've watched some of the videos, and I know that the thing that he says is that the people who have success with this work do it every day. And so I made a decision that day that I was going to start doing it every day. And to be honest with you, it was horrendous. I sat in the fire every single day. I wanted to crawl out of my own skin. Sometimes I couldn't make it through, the 23-minute morning meditation. But every day I would just come back and do it again and do it again. And experience that agony, and it really did feel like agony for me, but I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. But over time, it actually did start to get a little bit easier and a little bit easier, and then I found I could endure the 23-minute meditation, and I could keep going and keep trying it, and I was making my attempts to do the breath even though I didn't really know what I was doing. And so by the time, that was maybe 2 or 3 months between when I had made the decision to go and when the workshop was on, by the time that workshop started, I was doing changing beliefs and perceptions, I was doing reconditioning the body to a new mind, I was doing those meditations that were being introduced to us in the progressive workshop. And I could make it through. And so when we were leading up to the workshop in Toronto, I still definitely felt depressed, but I was no longer as suicidal, and I knew that by the time I finished that workshop in Toronto, that I wouldn't need to be on antidepressants anymore. And so a couple of weeks before that workshop, I went and saw my doctor, and I said to her, I don't need to take this anymore. And it kind of freaked her out, because here was this person who had been saying, like, if we don't do something here, you're gonna be, discharging my file because I won't be here anymore, to somebody who was saying, I want to come off this medication. So she did a really good job of kind of checking in with me about that, and we created a plan where I could taper and do it in a safe way. But I knew after that workshop that I was going to be done. And I didn't know why that was. So I went to Toronto, and there were so many parts of that workshop that were life-changing for me. I could talk for an hour about them. But probably the most profound was the challenge activity. And in Toronto, we went over the edge, where we rappelled down the side of the hotel, and it's been a memorable story that lots of people have talked about in terms of Dr. Joe's workshops. But when we went to do that challenge activity, for me, it was a very different experience than I perceived that it was for other people at the event or on my team, because I wasn't scared to do that activity, because I had literally driven around that city looking for a building like that, for a roof like that. And if you had given me access to that roof, there is not a doubt in my mind what I would have done. And so for me to be able to go and stand on that roof and not want to jump off it was a really big deal. And I understood enough by that point in the workshop that what I wanted to do was go through that experience in heart coherence. And I did. And I got to go down the side of the building and look out at the lake that I had, taken the ferry across my whole life, and the city that I was born and grew up in, and feel a new love for my life. And it was really an amazing experience. And when I got down to the bottom, several people on my team came up to me and said, like, what's going on with you? You look really different. And, nobody could kind of put their finger on it. But I realized at the end of that day that the challenge that I really had to face was to share my experience with my team. Because when we met as a team at the end of that evening, that's when this real anxiety came up for me, because I had to share this story in order to overcome those feelings of shame and insecurity and wanting to keep this part of myself, hidden away, where I had been depressed or I had been suicidal, because it just felt like a really shameful thing for me. And because I really perceived that experience in my life as well as a failure. And so the turning point for me was to be able to tell that story to my team. That was my challenge activity. So I finished Toronto. I had 1 week left in tapering my medications. I forgot on the second day after the event, and I just didn't finish the last few days. But I also had to confront coming back into that familiar environment after my event. So almost immediately when I came home, I felt intoxicated by the familiarity of that environment. And I was so aware of how easy it would be for me to go back to my old self. Even if it wasn't that super depressed version of myself, the version of myself who had lived totally under the control of the hormones of stress, who had lived in survival, who had, other survival emotions that had led to this crisis in my life in a way. And that's when I knew I had to hunker down and do another level of work. And so I did. And I now had a renewed commitment for this work because I could see what was possible from what I had seen at the event and what I had experienced for myself. And so I actually went and did another event in Cancun 3 or 4 months later. And what that made me realize was this, I had this idea in Toronto that I was at the peak of the mountain, like this was it, this was as good as it got. But when I did the event in Cancun, I realized, oh, just when I think I'm going to get to the peak of the mountain, the clouds are going to clear and there's a whole other peak. And you got to get climbing, you got to get going. And that was kind of daunting, but also super, super exciting in terms of the possibilities for me. And so since then, my career has completely transformed. I have a new job, a new opportunity that totally came out of the unknown. I was tuning into my dream career, and all of that unfolded in the most unexpected way, which has really made me come to realize how powerful I am. And so it's an exciting thing to have that manifestation in my life and to get to live that in my life. And so now I have another organization that I run, and I get to show up and I get to live in creation instead of living in survival. And I get to see where I show up as my new self and where I'm still recalibrating that old self. I'm also one of Dr. Joe's corporate trainers, which is a huge privilege because I get to take this work out into the world and share with other people the potential that this has for individuals and for teams. And that's just one of so many things that have happened for me with this work. And it just keeps expanding. It keeps showing me new possibilities in my life. And I feel an incredible amount of privilege to be a part of this community and a part of this work, because I know how hard it is to do that work, but also how amazing it is when you get to see the fruits of your labor. And I've had so many different experiences that I could share, but there is one that I think connects those events in Toronto and Cancun. When I was feeling so awful and I wasn't sleeping and I was lying in bed one night and I felt like my body was on fire. And it was just agonizing at every level, physical and emotional and spiritual. And I really thought maybe I was gonna die. And even if I wasn't gonna just die because of the experience, I just hoped that I would. And I remember lying in the bed feeling so horrendous and hearing this song in my head, clear, like somebody had turned on the radio. And this wasn't the first time that this had happened, but it was an unusual thing because sometimes I would have these songs that would just sort of flip on in my head, different than remembering a song that you'd heard on the radio. But this was the first time it had happened when I was having such a significant experience like I was lying in this bed. And the song that I heard when this happened was Frank Sinatra in my ears singing "The Best Is Yet to Come," which honestly really annoyed me at that time because it was like, I'm feeling so terrible and Frank Sinatra is singing at me that the best is yet to come. And so, you know, the story unfolded as I've described, but when I was doing walking meditation on the beach in Cancun, I had this experience that I did not expect. And at one point in the walking meditation, where I was pausing and standing in the meditation, I was no longer on the beach in Cancun. And all of a sudden, I was in the bedroom looking at me in that bed. So I knew that was me in the bed, but it was me as my consciousness looking at me lying there, remembering in a way what that felt like to be in that fire. And involuntarily, not remembering the part about that song that I had heard, I whispered in my own ear, "The best is yet to come." because that was the feeling that I was feeling in that walking meditation. And I had this knowingness in that moment that those experiences that I had had at a few different points in my life where that song had just come blasting in my head and it felt different than any other time that you get a song in your head. There was a visceral experience in my body. That was actually me connecting with me, and that the way that I could convey that message, because I didn't sing it in my own ear, I just whispered that knowingness that I had, that I knew that the best was yet to come, and that it just came through in that music in the way that I perceived it. And that was a game changer, because I knew that I really was living a more full, fulfilling life than I had even before I got sick. But there was also a lot more to this than I had ever imagined. That thing that Dr. Joe talks about, where he says, once you've experienced that transformation, you wouldn't go back and change anything. I understand what he means about that, because those experiences that I had felt so awful at the time, but I wouldn't go back and change any of those things because they led me here. And that just gives me energy and motivation to see what's next. And so it makes me love and embrace all the challenges that I have now, because I'm excited about where those are going to take me to.